The eye of Golgotha Prime was a swirling, bruised abyss of violet and sulfuric orange that occupied 90% of the viewport at the crown in orbit. It was a storm that had raged for 10,000 years, a planetary hurricane that dwarfed entire civilizations. Yet from the vantage point of the elite promenade on Ethelgard Hub, it looked like nothing more than a spectacular screensaver. Elias Vane swirled the remaining 3 centimeters of synthetic scotch in his glass. The ice had long since vanished, leaving the liquid lukewarm and tasting faintly of the industrial lubricants he spent 10 hours a day scrubbing off ventilation fans. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, a stiff, itchy thing he had bought with 2 weeks' worth of salvage credits, and checked his wrist comm for the 45th time. 1,900 hours and 20 minutes. "She's a no-show scrubber," the bartender said. He was a Xandarian with 4 arms and a face that looked like a topographical map of a bad neighborhood. 2 of his hands were busy polishing glasses, while the other 2 were recalibrating the tap system. Statistically, if a human woman is more than 15 minutes late for a first date in this sector, she's either been mugged in the lower pipes or she found a corporate suit with a private shuttle. Elias let out a dry, rattling laugh that caught in the recycled air of his lungs. "My buddy Miller swore she was different. Said she worked in the biolabs, liked guys who were grounded." "Grounded is just code for broke, Vane," the bartender grunted, sliding a bowl of salted protein puffs toward him. "Eat up, on the house. You look like you're about to fade into the upholstery." Elias looked at his reflection in the polished obsidian of the bar. At 48, he looked like a man who had seen the end of the world and decided it wasn't worth the overtime. His hair was a salt and pepper buzz cut, his skin mapped with the pale, jagged scars of a man who had spent his youth in the deep recon units and his middle age in the literal gutters of the station. He was a ghost in a cheap shirt, waiting for a woman who didn't exist. The wrist comm on his arm buzzed with a sharp staccato vibration. He tapped the holographic display. A single line of blue text hovered in the air. "I'm not coming. Something came up. Sorry, no explanation. No rescheduling. Just the digital equivalent of an airlock slamming shut." "Well?" the Xandarian asked. "Something came up," Elias said, his voice flat. He tapped the display to delete the message, but the words seemed to linger in his retinas. "Something always comes up." "Another round?" Elias glanced at the credit balance on his wrist. He had enough for one more drink, or he could afford a decent filter for his own respirator back in the barracks. The air in the lower decks had been tasting like ozone and burnt hair lately. "No," Elias said, sliding the glass back. "I've had enough disappointment for one rotation. I think I'll just sit here for a minute and watch the storm. At least the hurricane is honest about wanting to kill us." He turned his stool around, facing the dining room. The Crown in Orbit was the kind of mid-tier place where middle management came to feel like executives and refugees came to feel like people. The air was thick with the scent of seared spices and the low-level hum of waiter drones. That was when he saw them. They were tucked into a corner table, partially obscured by a decorative pillar of fake Martian ivy. They were Caldari, vulpine humanoids with russet fur, large, expressive ears, and eyes that held the terrifying clarity of a species that could hear a heartbeat from across a hangar bay. In the lower docks, Caldari were common, usually seen hauling heavy crates or working the dangerous chemical vats. But in a place like this, they stuck out like a solar flare in a dark room. There were 3 of them, a mother and 2 kits. The mother, a vixen with silver-streaked fur around her muzzle, sat with a posture that was painfully rigid. Her ears were flattened slightly, a sign of extreme anxiety. She wore a tunic of coarse, sun-bleached fabric, cleaned until the fibers were translucent. On the table sat a single steaming bowl of nutrient broth and a basket containing 3 small bread rolls. 1 bowl for 3 people. Elias watched, his cynical heart giving a traitorous thud. The vixen took one of the bread rolls and tore it into 3 perfectly equal pieces. She slid the largest 2 toward the kits, a boy about 10 and a girl no older than 6. Then she took her own tiny fragment and dipped it into the broth, letting it soak up the liquid to make it feel heavier, more substantial. She ate with slow, deliberate grace, as if she were at a royal banquet, rather than splitting a snack in a station corner. Her eyes flicked constantly to the holographic menu floating above the table. Elias could see the numbers reflected in her dark pupils. Every time the price of an extra side dish scrolled past, she flinched. She wasn't just eating, she was performing a mathematical feat of survival. Elias felt a familiar, cold ache in his marrow. He knew that look. He had seen it in the ruins of the Reach colonies. He had seen it in the eyes of mothers holding children in the mud, while the Ouroboros Corp security ships orbited above, waiting for the smoke to clear so they could claim the mineral rights. He began to stand up, his boots clanging softly against the metal floor. His instinct was to leave. It was easier to be alone in his 8x8 coffin in the barracks than to watch the slow-motion collision of dignity and poverty. He had spent 10 years minding his own business, scrubbing the fans, and drinking himself into a stupor. But then, the shadow fell over their table. A man in the navy and chrome armor of Ouroboros private security stepped out from the crowd. He wasn't station police. Those guys were tired and mostly human. This was a contract enforcement officer. He was broad, well-fed, and carried a shock baton on his hip like it was a holy relic. He didn't pull up a chair. He simply stood over the Caldari family, his presence blotting out the light from the promenade. Elias sat back down. He didn't mean to, but his body had reverted to a combat-ready state he hadn't used in a decade. He tapped a sequence on his wrist comm, slaving his earpiece to the directional microphone of the table's service drone. It was a trick for diagnosing humming pipes, but it worked perfectly for eavesdropping. Interest rates on the resettlement bond don't care about your double shifts, Miss Vane. The officer's voice crackled in Elias's ear. It was smooth, oily, and entirely devoid of mercy. I paid the installment, the vixen replied. Her voice was melodic, despite the tremor of terror. 60 credits this morning. That was more than half my earnings for the cycle. 60 credits barely covers the administrative processing fee for the transaction, the officer said. He reached down, picked up one of the untouched bread rolls, turned it over with mock curiosity, and dropped it back into the basket. It landed with a dry, pathetic thud. You're still 3,000 credits in the hole for the relocation tickets. Director Mororo is a patient woman, but her patience isn't a charity. We cannot pay what we do not have, the mother whispered. Her ears were pinned back now, her tail curled tightly around the leg of her chair. Well, there's always the alternative labor path, the officer said, his voice dropping into a predatory purr. He leaned closer to the 10-year-old boy. The boy is what? 10 cycles? He's got nimble fingers. The micro-assembly plant in Sector 9 is always looking for interns. We could sign over a percentage of his future labor value. It would zero out your interest immediately. Elias felt the air in the room turn to liquid nitrogen. Future labor value was the corporate euphemism for indentured servitude. They were talking about selling a child into the vats before he'd even reached his full height. The boy, Jax, looked up, his golden eyes wide with a terror so pure it could have powered the station's reactor. Kaylin moved instantly, her hands snapping out to pull the boy behind her. No, she said, her voice rising. My children are not for sale, not for credits, not for anything. Everyone on this hub is for sale, Vay, the officer sighed, looking bored. You're breathing Ouroboros air, eating Ouroboros broth. You pay with coin or you pay with sweat. I'll give you 24 hours to consider the restructuring. If the account isn't green by next rotation, we'll revoke your residency permit. And you know what they do with vagrants on Ethelgard. He didn't need to finish. Everyone knew. Vagrants were recycled or ejected. Elias Vane sat motionless. Inside his head, a rusted, heavy switch flicked. It was a switch he had tried to weld shut with a decade of cheap synthetic scotch and silence. But the sound of a man threatening to sell a child triggered a neural pathway that bypasses the cynicism of the middle-aged janitor. His eyes lost their fatigue. The slouch in his shoulders vanished. He wasn't Elias the Scrubber anymore. He was Sergeant Vane of the 7th Deep Recon. He analyzed the room in 3 seconds. Target, 1 security officer. Weapons, shock baton, holstered, probable concealed stun pistol. Environment, high witness count, multiple cameras. Sector 4C node, currently malfunctioning. He knew because he'd skipped the repair yesterday. Violence was a bad option. It would get the family deported and him airlocked. He needed a different kind of weapon. He looked at the blue text on his wrist. I'm not coming. Fine, Elias whispered. The table's already paid for. He stood up. He didn't rush. He moved with the loose, predatory confidence of a man who had walked through minefields while whistling. He grabbed his half-finished glass of whiskey and strolled toward the corner. The officer was just about to deliver one final insult when Elias hooked his foot around an empty chair from a neighboring table, dragged it over, and slammed it down right next to the officer, startling the man into a stumble. Elias sat down, planted his calloused, grease-stained elbows on the table, and beamed a radiant, utterly terrifying smile at the stunned Kalen Vane. "Kalen!" Elias boomed, his voice projecting across the restaurant like a drill sergeant's. "I am so sorry I'm late. You would not believe the mess down in the primary oxygen scrubbers. Some idiot dropped a heavy-duty wrench into the intake fan. Took me 2 hours just to fish the bits out." The table went silent. Kalen stared at him, her muzzle slightly open, her ears swiveling frantically as she tried to process this massive, scarred human who had just hijacked her dinner. The kids looked at him like he was a glitch in the simulation. The security officer blinked, his rhythm completely shattered. "Excuse me, who the hell are you?" Elias didn't even look at him. He reached across the table, grabbed the bread basket, and offered it to the boy Jax. "Go on, kid. Don't wait for me. I know you're hungry." Then he turned his gaze slowly, very slowly, to the officer. He let his eyes linger on the man's polished boots, then his belt, then his face. "I'm the guy who was supposed to be here 20 minutes ago," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. It wasn't loud, but it had a vibration to it, like a heavy engine idling in a closed room. "And you're standing in my light, which is a problem because I'm already in a bad mood." "This is official Ouroboros business, scrubber," the officer snapped, though he stepped back half a pace. "Move along before I add you to the debt list." Elias leaned back, the cheap chair creaking. "Official business? That's funny. I didn't see a case authorization number on your display. And according to Section 42 of the Hub Residency Act, you know, the one the Corp likes to cite when they're evicting people, debt collection activities are strictly prohibited in public dining establishments during active service hours. It's considered patron harassment." He pointed a finger at the black glass bubble in the ceiling. "And since that camera is definitely recording, which I know because I'm the tech who services it, I'm sure the Oversight Committee would love to see a transcript of you soliciting a minor for a labor contract. That's a Class 1 ethics violation. Carries a mandatory forfeiture of your quarterly bonus. Maybe your badge too." It was a total lie. The camera was as dead as Elias's date. The officer's eyes darted from Elias to the camera, then to Kalen. He saw a human veteran with eyes like flint and a voice that knew too much about the rules. He calculated the risk. Squeezing a helpless Kaldari mother was a sport. Squeezing a veteran who knew the bylaws was a mountain of paperwork. "You have 24 hours, Vane," the officer hissed, trying to salvage his dignity. He glared at Elias. "And you, keep your nose in the vents, her scrubber. It's safer there." He turned on his heel and marched away, his boots clicking angrily on the obsidian floor. Elias exhaled, the adrenaline leaving a bitter metallic taste in his mouth. He looked at Kalen. She was still frozen, her hand clutching the edge of the table so hard her claws had pierced the synthetic cloth. "Who are you?" the boy Jax whispered. "I'm Elias," he said, setting his glass down. He looked at the meager bowl of cold broth. "And I'm a guy whose date just stood him up. Left me with a clean shirt and a full credit chip. It's a tragedy, really." He looked at Kalen, his expression softening. "I hate eating alone. It makes me feel pathetic. Would you and your kits consider it a personal favor to help me finish a real meal? My treat. If I go back to the barracks with all these credits, I'll just spend them on something stupid, like a robotic goldfish." Kalen searched his face. She wasn't looking for a lie. She was listening. Her ears twitched, catching the rhythm of his heart. She found no predatory intent, no hidden agenda, just a vast, echoing loneliness that matched her own. "We cannot pay you back," she said softly. "The payment is the company," Elias said. He signaled a waiter drone. "Menu, full access, and bring 3 chocolate malts, large ones." As the kits gasped in unison, Elias noticed the small hexagonal tag hanging from a chain around the little girl's neck. It bore a logo, a stylized hawk gripping a lightning bolt. His heart stopped. Epsilon Logistics. That was the unit that had abandoned his squad on the ground 12 years ago. The unit that had been officially disbanded after the war. He looked at the little girl, Miri, who was currently wiggling her ears in excitement for the chocolate milk. Elias realized with a sinking dread that this wasn't a chance meeting. He hadn't just joined a lonely family for dinner. He had just stumbled into the mouth of the ghost that had been haunting him for a decade. "Roasted solar fin for everyone?" Elias asked, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "I hear it's better than the broth." The chocolate malt arrived in 3 tall, frosted glasses that looked like treasures from a lost age. Miri, the 6-year-old, stared at the whipped cream on top as if it were a rare celestial nebula. She didn't drink it at first. She simply reached out and touched the frost on the glass with one paw, her cream-tipped ears perking up so high they almost touched the ivy above. "It's cold," she whispered, her eyes wide. "Mama, it's actually cold." Kaylin Vane didn't answer. She was watching Elias Vane with an intensity that made him feel like he was back in the interrogation rooms of the inner ring. Her species didn't just see the world, they heard the truth behind it. To a Kaldari, a human heart was a drum that told a story. "You are not a maintenance worker," Kaylin said, her voice a low melodic hum that barely carried over the restaurant's chatter. Elias paused, his fork hovering over a plate of seared protein steaks that had just been delivered. "I've got the grease under my fingernails and the bad back to prove otherwise, Kaylin. I scrubbed the fans in Sector 7. I'm a professional rust remover." "Your hands are steady," she countered, pointing a slender furred finger at his glass. "Most humans on this station have a tremor, from the recycled air or the stress or the stims. Your heart beats at 48 pulses per minute. It is the rhythm of a man who is waiting for a sniper's bullet, not a man who fixes air conditioners." Elias took a slow bite of his steak. It tasted like heaven and salt. "I told you, I used to be a soldier. Old habits die hard. You spend enough time in the mud, you learn how to keep your pulse down so the heat seekers don't find you." "A soldier of the 7th Deep Recon," Kaylin said. Elias froze. The steak turned to lead in his mouth. He swallowed hard and looked her in the eye. "How do you know that? I didn't mention the unit." Kaylin leaned forward, her ears swiveling to track a waiter drone before it could get too close. "I was a scholar of historical linguistics at the University of Vaelia before the relocation. I recognize the cadence of your slang. Grounded, scrubber, oops protocols, and the way you stand when an officer enters the room. You're not just a veteran, Elias. You're a survivor of the Nebula Purge." "We're all survivors of something," Elias said, his voice turning defensive. "Look, I bought the dinner to keep that suit off your back, not to give a history lesson. Eat. The kids are finishing their malts and starting to eye my fries." Jax, the 10-year-old, was indeed eyeing the golden potato wedges. "Is it true, Mr. Elias? Did you really fight the swarm?" "I fought a lot of things, Jax," Elias said, sliding the plate of fries toward the boy. "Mostly I fought the urge to fall asleep during guard duty. It's not like the Hollows. It's mostly waiting around in the rain for something to break." "My da was a pilot," Jack said, his voice proud but tinged with a sharp edge of grief. "He flew a star cutter. He stayed behind to draw the fire so our transport could reach the warp gate. Mama says he's a star now." Elias looked at Kaylin. Her eyes were fixed on the table, her tail lying limp against the floor. He saw the Epsilon Logistics tag again on Miri's neck, the hawk and the lightning bolt. "That tag," Elias said, nodding toward Miri. "Epsilon. Where did you get it?" Kaylin's expression hardened. She reached out and tucked the tag inside Miri's tunic, hiding it from view. "It was our integration marker. When the Ouroboros Corp picked us up from the refugee flotilla near the rim, they assigned us to the Epsilon Labor Group. They said it was a specialized unit for high-dexterity workers. They promised us housing and a path to citizenship." "A specialized unit," Elias repeated, a bitter taste rising in his throat. "That's what they're calling it now." "You know them," Kaylin stated. It wasn't a question. "I know them," Elias said. 12 years ago, my squad was pinned down on a rock called Garrison 9. We were supposed to hold the line for 48 hours until Epsilon Logistics arrived with the extraction craft. We held for 72. We ran out of ammo, out of water, out of hope. Epsilon never showed. They sent a burst transmission saying the sector was economically non-viable for a rescue mission. I was the only one who made it to a life pod. Kalen's ears twitched violently. She could hear the sudden, frantic spike in his heart rate. Economically non-viable, she whispered. That is the same phrase they used to deny my husband's veteran pension. They said his service record was lost during a data optimization event. It wasn't lost, Elias growled. Ouroboros didn't just buy the station. They bought the war's leftovers. They bought the ships, the contracts, and the people. They use Epsilon to manage the high-risk assets. That's us, the ones with no one left to complain when we disappear. The dinner, once a moment of sanctuary, felt suddenly cold. The vast storm of Golgotha Prime raged outside, a silent witness to the smaller storms inside the hub. Why are you helping us, Elias Vane? Kalen asked. Her voice was no longer suspicious, but it was heavy with a different kind of fear. You are a human. You could live a quiet life here. You could ignore the Kaldari in the corner. Why put yourself in the sights of contract enforcement? Elias looked at Miri, who had a mustache of chocolate foam on her upper lip and was currently trying to use a straw as a telescope. He thought of his date who didn't come. He thought of the 40 men he had left behind on Garrison 9. He thought of the decade he had spent scrubbing vents, trying to pretend the air didn't smell like blood. Because, Elias said, I realized tonight that I'm tired of being economically viable. And because your daughter has ears that move, and that's a hell of a lot more interesting than anything else on this station. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, hexagonal data spike. It was a maintenance tool used for bypassing encrypted door locks during emergencies. He slid it across the table toward Kalen. What is this? My oops insurance, Elias said. I've been poking around the energy grids lately. There's a ghost load coming from Sector 89. Officially, it's a decommissioned warehouse. In reality, it's drawing enough power to run a heavy-duty neural interface array. I think that's where the disappeared workers are going. Kalen, if you're working traffic control, you have access to the docking manifest. I need you to find out what ships are landing in Bay 4 on Tuesday nights. Kalen stared at the data spike. To touch it was to commit treason against Ouroboros. To ignore it was to wait for the officer to come back in 24 hours and take her son. If we do this, Kalen whispered, there is no going back. They will hunt us. They're already hunting you, Elias said. You just haven't heard the hounds yet. But I have. I've been hearing them for 12 years. Suddenly, Jax gasped. Mama, look! A waiter drone drifted past their table, but instead of the usual menu, its holographic display was flickering with a red alert symbol. Across the restaurant, wrist comms began to chime in a discordant, haunting chorus. Attention all residents, a smooth, synthesized female voice announced over the hub's speakers. A localized atmospheric breach has been detected in the lower maintenance sectors. Sector 7 is now under mandatory lockdown. All non-essential personnel are to remain in their current locations. Security teams are deploying to conduct safety inspections. Elias stood up, his hand reflexively going to the small of his back where a pistol should have been. Sector 7. That was his sector. Safety inspections, Elias muttered. That's code for a sweep. They're looking for someone. The officer, Kalen said, her ears flat against her skull. He didn't wait 24 hours. He went to your quarters, Elias. He found your files. Maybe, Elias said. He looked at the exit. A squad of 3 security guards was already positioning themselves at the main door of the Crown in orbit. They weren't looking for a breach. They were scanning faces. New plan, Elias said, his voice shifting back to the sergeant's rasp. Kalen, grab the kids. We're not leaving through the door. Then where? Elias looked up at the ivy-covered pillar. I'm a scrubber, remember? I know every inch of the ventilation system. And I happen to know that the intake vent behind this pillar leads directly to the gravity chutes in Sector 12. It's too small, Kalen hissed, looking at the narrow metal grate. For a human, yeah, Elias grinned, a fierce, jagged thing. But for a fox and her kits, it's a highway. I'll stay behind and give them something to look at. Meet me at the Hydra Garden in 3 hours. If I'm not there, take the kids to the docking ring and find a ship named the Void Runner. Tell the pilot Elias Vane sent you to collect a debt. Elias! Kalen reached out, her hand brushing his arm. For a second, their heartbeats synchronized, one frantic and melodic, the other steady and grim. Why do you choose the hard path? Because the easy one is crowded with cowards, Elias said. He grabbed his heavy maintenance jacket and threw it over his shoulder. Now move, before the soup gets cold. As the family vanished behind the ivy, Elias Vane sat back down at the table. He picked up a bread roll, tore it in half, and waited. He looked out at the storm of Golgotha Prime and wondered if he'd finally found a reason to stop drinking. The security guards were 10 meters away when Elias raised his glass in a silent toast to the empty chair across from him. I told you, he whispered to the ghost of his date. I really hate eating alone. The first guard reached the table, his hand on his baton. Elias Vane, you're under arrest for unauthorized access to restricted data cores. Elias didn't look up. He just took a bite of the roll. You guys are late, he said, his voice dripping with sarcastic venom. The steak's already gone, and frankly, your service is terrible. The hub's red lights pulsed like a dying heart. The game was no longer about scrubbing vents. The veteran was back in the mud, and this time, he wasn't planning on being the only survivor. Elias Vane did not move when the lead security officer reached the table. The man was a typical Ouroboros hireling, a slab of muscle wrapped in a pressurized suit that cost more than Elias had earned in the last 5 years. The officer's visor was polarized, reflecting Elias's own tired face back at him. On the man's chest, the corporate sigil, a serpent eating its own tail, glowed with a soft, predatory light. Identification, scrubber, the guard barked. His voice was processed through a vocal synthesizer that stripped away every ounce of humanity, leaving only a metallic rasp. Elias took a slow, deliberate bite of the bread roll. He chewed, swallowed, and then looked up with an expression of mild, calculated boredom. He let a small, mocking smile play across his lips. The slang of the trenches, the sharp, jagged language of the deep recon, began to bubble up to the surface. You are a bit late for the party, Slick, Elias said. He leaned back, the cheap chair groaning in protest. My ID is exactly where it always is. In the station database, right next to the work order for that broken camera in the corner. You know, the one you guys were supposed to fix 3 rotations ago. The guard's hand shifted toward the shock baton on his hip. Do not get smart with me, Vane. We have a report of a localized data breach in Sector 7, your sector, and we have witnesses seeing you consorting with unregistered Xenos. Consorting? Elias raised an eyebrow. That is a big word for a guy who probably had to have his boots labeled left and right this morning. I was having dinner. My date didn't show, so I shared my soup with some hungry travelers. Last I checked, being a decent person wasn't a Class 1 violation, unless the board changed the bylaws while I was in the vents. The officer leaned in, his heavy armored chest plates clicking against the edge of the table. The smell of high-grade ozone and expensive cologne drifted from him. Where are they? Elias picked up his whiskey glass, swirled the amber liquid, and drained it. He let out a long, satisfied sigh. Who? The travelers. They finished their broth and moved on. Said something about the air in here being a bit too thick with corporate arrogance. Probably headed for the lower docks. Or maybe the moon. Who knows? The officer's visor pulsed red. A facial scan was happening. Elias felt the familiar prickle of a laser sweep against his retinas. He didn't blink. He had spent years learning how to mask his biometric signature with a rhythmic twitch of his facial muscles, a trick taught to him by a sniper who had survived 3 months behind swarm lines. Search him, the officer commanded his 2 subordinates. Elias didn't resist. He stood up slowly, arms raised, as the other 2 guards moved in. They were rough, their gloved hands slapping against his maintenance jacket, searching for weapons or data drives. One of them pulled out a small bent wrench and a handful of copper washers. He threw them onto the table with a contemptuous clatter. He is clean, sir, the guard reported. Just a gearhead. The lead officer didn't look convinced. His posture was tense, his head tilted as if he were receiving a private transmission. After a moment, he stepped back. Sector 7 is still in lockdown, Vane. You are to report to the security hub for a formal inquiry. Move. Elias shrugged. Sure thing. Just let me pay my tab. I wouldn't want the corp to lose out on those 3 credits. As he turned toward the bar, Elias caught the reflection of the restaurant in the black obsidian pillars. Kalen and the kits were gone. The ivy-covered pillars stood silent. He had given them a 3-minute lead. In the labyrinth of Ethelgard Hub, 3 minutes was an eternity if you knew the shortcuts. He didn't plan on going to the security hub. He planned on disappearing into the one place where Ouroboros had no eyes, the station's lungs. Kaylin Vay's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She moved through the ventilation shaft with a silent, fluid grace that felt ancient, a ghost of the hunters her ancestors had been before they learned to build cities. Behind her, she could hear the labored breathing of Jax and the soft, terrified whimpers of Miri. The air in the vents was hot and tasted of old metal and the chemical sprays used to kill the mold that grew on the humidity collectors. To a Caldari, the hub was not a structure of steel and glass. It was a cacophony of vibrations. She could hear the hum of the fusion reactors 6 levels below, the rhythmic thud of the maglev trains in the core, and the frantic, high-pitched chatter of 1,000 data streams flowing through the fiber optic cables clamped to the shaft walls. But most of all, she could hear the fear. It was a frequency that resonated in her kit's bones. "Mama, it is too dark," Miri whispered. Her ears were pressed flat against her head, rubbing against the top of the cramped metal tunnel. "Follow the sound of my tail, little star," Kaylin murmured back. Her voice was a low, soothing vibration, designed to mask the sound of their movement from any acoustic sensors in the walls. "Keep your paws on the rivets. We are almost to the soot stacks." The soot stacks were the colloquial name for the Sector 12 habitation modules. It was the place where the Caldari refugees had been dumped, a vertical slum of repurposed shipping containers and decaying dormitories located directly above the station's primary thermal exhaust ports. The air there was always 10 degrees too hot, and the walls were permanently coated in a fine layer of carbon dust. Kaylin reached the exit grate. She paused, her ears swiveling to listen to the corridor beyond. She heard the heavy, rhythmic tread of a maintenance droid and the distant, muffled argument of 2 Tellarite dock workers. No security. Not yet. She pushed the grate open. It didn't scream. Elias had told her that he had oiled every grate on this level months ago during a phantom repair job. She slid out, catching Miri as the little girl tumbled into her arms. Jax followed, his fur standing on end from the static electricity of the vents. They moved quickly through the shadows of the corridor. Sector 12 was a place of deep rust and flickering lights. Here, the polished obsidian of the upper promenade was replaced by dented steel plates and exposed wiring. Groups of Caldari sat in the doorways of their containers, their tails wrapped tightly around their legs, their eyes watching the kits with a mixture of pity and suspicion. In the soot stacks, being noticed was a death sentence. Kaylin reached their unit, Module 48. It was a metal box no larger than a human's walk-in closet. Inside, the air was thick and stagnant. She ushered the kits inside and slid the heavy door shut, engaging the manual deadbolt. Jax immediately collapsed onto the bottom bunk, his chest heaving. "Why did that man help us, Mama? He is a human. They don't help. They just take." Kaylin sat on the edge of the bunk, her hands trembling as she pulled Miri into her lap. "I do not know, Jax. He is a man of many layers. His heart, it sounds like a drum that has been left in the rain. It is heavy, and it is broken, but it still beats with a rhythm of protection." "He gave you a data spike," Jax noted, pointing to the pocket of her tunic. "What are you going to do with it?" Kaylin reached into her pocket and pulled out the hexagonal tool. It felt cold and heavy. In her mind, she saw the Epsilon tag around Miri's neck. She thought of the officer's oily voice, talking about selling Jax's future labor. "I am going to find the Tuesday manifests," Kaylin said, her voice hardening. "I am going to see if the stars are as honest as the scrubber says they are." Suddenly, Miri let out a sharp, pained cry. She clutched at her throat, her cream-colored ears twitching violently. "Miri!" Kaylin gasped, pulling the girl's hands away. Under the collar of Miri's tunic, the hexagonal integration tag was pulsing with a harsh, flickering amber light. It wasn't just a barcode anymore. It was emitting a low-frequency hum that Kaylin could feel in her own teeth. "It is the anchor," Jax whispered, his eyes wide with horror. They activated the regional frequency. The neural anchor was Ouroboros's greatest achievement in refugee management. It wasn't a physical leash. It was an acoustic one. The tags were tuned to the specific resonant frequency of the Caldari inner ear. When activated, they broadcasted a subsonic pulse that induced a state of overwhelming, paralyzing anxiety. It made the wearer unable to move, unable to think, and eventually entirely submissive to whatever commands were broadcasted over the station's intercom. Kaylin felt the edges of the frequency scratching at her own mind. Her ears began to ring, a high-pitched whine that made the room tilt. "Stay down," Kaylin ordered Jax, who was already clawing at his own collar. "Do not fight the pulse, and if you fight it, the neurotransmitters will spike." She scrambled to her feet, her vision blurring. She needed to dampen the signal. She looked around the small module, her eyes landing on a roll of lead-lined thermal tape she had scavenged from the docks. She grabbed it, her fingers clumsy and slow. She tried to wrap the tape around Miri's tag, but the little girl was thrashing, her tail whipping back and forth in a blind panic. "Miri, please!" The door to the module suddenly shuddered. A heavy metallic thud echoed through the room. "Ouroboros Security, open up! We have a report of an unauthorized residency status." Kaylin froze. The ringing in her ears reached a crescendo. She looked at the door, then at her kits, then at the data spike in her hand. She was trapped. The scrubber had given them a chance, but the corp was too fast. The door groaned as a hydraulic ram was applied to the frame. "Mama!" Jack screamed, his ears bleeding from the pressure of the subsonic pulse. Then the lights in the module flickered and died. The high-pitched whine of the neural anchor abruptly vanished, replaced by a sudden jarring silence. Through the darkness, the sound of a heavy impact came from the other side of the door. There was a grunt of pain, the crackle of a shock baton discharging, and the sound of several bodies hitting the metal floor of the corridor. A familiar, gravelly voice drifted through the door. "You know, the problem with you guys is that you rely too much on the tech," the voice said. "You forget that a simple circuit breaker in the subfloor can turn off your toys just as easily as a password." The manual bolt on the door clicked. The slab slid open, revealing the silhouette of a man framed by the dim red emergency lights of the hallway. Elias Vane stood there, his maintenance jacket torn and his knuckles bloody. He was holding a heavy industrial magnetic wrench in one hand and a portable signal jammer in the other. "Sorry I'm late again," Elias grunted, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. The traffic in the secondary chutes was a nightmare. Some idiot tried to set a trap for me. I had to show him the business end of a pipe cutter. He looked at Miri, who was staring up at him in dazed silence. He knelt down, his large, scarred hand moving with surprising gentleness to check the pulse at her neck. "The anchor is dead, kid," he said softly. "I fried the regional relay on my way here. You're okay." Kaylin stared at him, her ears slowly rising from their flattened position. "You came to the soot stacks. Do you have any idea what they will do to a human found in this sector during a lockdown?" "They'll probably dock my pay," Elias said, standing up and wiping a smear of grease from his forehead. "But since I've already decided to quit, I don't think I care much about the quarterly review." He looked at Kaylin, his eyes hard as flint. "We have to move. The relay I fried is going to trigger a system-wide diagnostic in 20 minutes. When the grid comes back online, they'll have every drone on the station sniffing for your biosigns." "Where are we going?" Jax asked, grabbing his small backpack. "To my workshop," Elias said. "It's a rust bucket in the industrial ring, but it's got enough lead lining to hide a small army. And more importantly, it's got a hardline connection to the docking servers that doesn't go through the central firewall." He looked at Kaylin, his heart beating with that heavy, broken rhythm she had heard before. "Are you ready to see what's on those Tuesday ships, Kaylin? Because once we look, there's no turning back. We'll be ghosts." Kaylin reached out and took his hand. Her furred fingers were small against his calloused palm, but her grip was like iron. "We have been ghosts since the day our world burned, Elias Vane," she said. "It is time we started haunting the people who set the fire." Elias nodded. "Then let's move. Stay in the shadows, stay quiet, and if anyone asks, you're just a part of my specialized cleaning crew." The scrubber led the way into the dark, his steady heart the only drum they needed to follow. The workshop in Sector 89 was a cathedral of discarded technology. Twisted hydraulic arms hung from the ceiling like frozen mechanical serpents, and stacks of rusted hull plating created a maze of sharp edges and cold shadows. The air smelled of burnt oil, ancient dust, and the sharp metallic tang of the Golgotha Prime storm that bled through the station's outer hull vibrations. Elias Vane moved through the clutter with the ease of a man who knew the secret history of every piece of junk in the room. He led Kalen and the kits to a small, enclosed office in the back, shielded by thick plates of lead and reinforced polyglass. "Sit," Elias commanded, pointing to a pair of mismatched pilot seats he had salvaged from a freighter wreck. "Jax, there's a crate of protein bars under the desk. They aren't nebula cake, but they'll keep your stomach from growling loud enough to trigger the sensors." Kalen sat, her ears still twitching toward the door. She felt the heavy silence of the industrial ring, a silence that felt more dangerous than the noise of the promenade. "Why is this place not on the security maps, Elias?" "Because the Corp thinks it's a biohazard zone," Elias said, sitting at a workstation that looked like it had been kit-bashed together from a dozen different centuries. 5 years ago, a coolant line burst in the subfloor, released a bunch of toxic spores. Ouroboros didn't want to pay for the cleanup, so they just marked the sector as condemned and locked the primary airlocks. They forgot that I'm the one who handles the secondary ventilation overrides. He began tapping at the keyboard, his fingers moving with a speed and precision that belied his age. Streams of green and blue code began to cascade across the monitors, reflecting in his eyes. Kalen leaned in, her gaze fixed on the data. "You are using a deep recon encryption key," she noted. "That is a military protocol. If they catch you using that, it is an act of treason." "Everything I've done tonight is an act of treason, Kalen," Elias grunted. "I'm just being efficient about it. Now show me what you found at traffic control." "Did you get the manifest for Tuesday night?" Kalen reached into her tunic and pulled out a small, crumpled data slate she had hidden during the flight. She slotted it into Elias's terminal. The screen flickered, then displayed a list of arrivals for Bay 4 over the last 3 months. "The ship is called the Stellar Reaper," Kalen said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It arrives every Tuesday at 2300 hours. It is registered as a Class 4 bulk carrier for industrial silicates. But the fuel consumption is all wrong." Elias leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the telemetry data. "You're right. A bulk carrier full of sand doesn't need that much thruster output for a docking maneuver. This thing is carrying something much lighter, or something that needs a hell of a lot of life support power." He cross-referenced the manifest with the energy logs he had stolen earlier. The power spikes in Sector 89 coincided perfectly with the Stellar Reaper's arrival. "Look at this," Elias said, pointing to a hidden directory in the manifest metadata. "The cargo isn't silicates. It's listed under a subheader, Asset Recovery Unit 7. Kalen's ears flattened. "My husband's unit was Unit 7, before the relocation." Elias went silent. He looked at the screen, then at Kalen, then at the kits who were quietly sharing a protein bar in the corner. The layers were beginning to peel, and the truth underneath was more grotesque than he had imagined. "Asset recovery," Elias muttered. "That's what they call it when they strip a planet of its people after the war's over." "Kalen, Ouroboros isn't just managing refugees. They're recycling them." "What does that mean?" Kalen asked, her voice trembling. "It means they're taking the Caldari with high technical skills, the weavers, the scholars, the pilots, and they're using them as biological processors for their new AI network. They call it Project Chimera. I heard rumors of it during my final tour. They needed minds that could handle high-frequency acoustic data. Minds like yours." The realization hit Kalen like a physical blow. She clutched the edge of the desk, her claws leaving deep grooves in the metal. The integration tags, the neural anchors, they aren't just for control. "No," Elias said, his voice grim. "They are interface ports. Once the anchor is tuned correctly, they can slave your nervous system to the hub's mainframe. You become a living part of the station's infrastructure, a ghost worker. You breathe, you think, you process data, but you don't exist anymore. No name, no debt, no life. Just a line of code in the Ouroboros ledger." Kalen looked at Miri, who was currently laughing at a sticker Jax had placed on her ear. The horror of it was so vast, so clinical, that it threatened to drown her. "They were going to take my daughter. They were going to turn her into a machine." Not while I'm breathing, Elias said. His voice was no longer that of a cynical janitor. It was the voice of the man who had held the ridge at Garrison 9. He stood up and walked to a heavy metal locker at the far end of the workshop. He keyed in a complex biometric code. The door hissed open, revealing a collection of gear that definitely didn't belong to a maintenance worker. There was a tactical bodysuit made of kinetic weave, a bandolier of EMP grenades, and a long, sleek pulse rifle with the 7th Deep Recon insignia etched into the stock. "Elias," Kalen said, standing up, "what are you doing?" "I spent 10 years trying to convince myself that I didn't know the universe anything," Elias said, his back to her. "I told myself that I was just a part that Ouroboros had discarded, and that as long as I kept my head down, I was safe. But I was wrong. Silence isn't safety. It's just a slow way to die." He turned to face her, his eyes burning with a purpose she had never seen in a human. "My date didn't show up tonight, Kalen. And for the first time in a decade, I'm glad. Because if she had, I would have spent the evening talking about the weather and pretending the air didn't taste like ozone. Instead, I'm sitting here with a linguistics scholar who can hear my heartbeat and 2 kids who deserve to see a real sky." He checked the charge on the pulse rifle. "The Stellar Reaper docks in 4 hours. It's coming into Bay 4. That bay is right next to the primary communication array." "You want to broadcast the manifest," Kalen realized. "I want to broadcast everything," Elias said. "The manifests, the energy logs, the Project Chimera files. I want to turn the whole hub into one giant OOPS protocol. If the Outer Rim Council sees what's happening here, Ouroboros loses their charter. They'll be out of this sector by dawn." "But you cannot do this alone," Kalen said. "The security at the array is automated. You need a linguistics expert to bypass the vocal ciphers. You need someone who can hear the frequencies of the firewall." Elias looked at her, his heart skipping a beat. "It's a suicide run, Kalen. If we fail, they won't just recycle us. They'll erase the kits, too." Kalen walked over to him. She reached out and touched the scar on his neck, her ears perking up in defiance. "My kits are already being erased by this station, Elias Vane. I would rather they be the children of a ghost who fought than the property of a corporation that optimized them." She looked him in the eye. "Besides, you have a terrible sense of direction in the data streams. You'll get lost without a navigator." Elias let out a short, genuine laugh. He reached out and ruffled Jax's fur as the boy walked over. "All right, Jax. You and Miri are going to stay here. This room is a fortress. I've rigged the door to only open for your thumbprint or mine. There's enough water and bars for a week. Do not make a sound. Do not touch the red buttons. And if the lights go out, just wait for the stars to come back." Jax nodded, his face set in a grim line that mirrored his mother's. "I'll keep her safe, Mr. Elias. I'll be the pilot." "Good lad," Elias said. He handed Kalen a tactical headset. "We're going to use the garbage chutes to get to the spire. It's dirty, it's smelly, and there's a 60% chance we'll get compacted if the timing is off." Kalen smiled, her sharp teeth gleaming in the blue light. "As long as I do not have to eat any more of your protein broth, I can handle a little garbage." Elias grabbed his rifle and slung it over his shoulder. He looked one last time at the kits, a silent promise forming in the back of his mind. He wasn't just a scrubber anymore. He was the ghost of Sector 7, and he was about to give Ouroboros the worst night of their corporate lives. "Let's go, Slick," Elias said to himself. "Time to earn that scotch." They stepped out into the industrial darkness, 2 shadows moving against the grinding gears of a dying empire. The storm of Golgotha Prime raged outside, but inside the hub, the real hurricane was just beginning. The journey through the garbage chutes was a descent into a mechanical underworld. Elias and Kalen slid through miles of slick, grooved piping, dodging the massive sorting blades that cycled every 45 seconds with the bone-jarring thud of a guillotine. Elias led the way, his boots magnetized to the side of the chutes, his hand constantly checking the portable sensor array. Kalen followed him, her tail tucked tight, her ears swiveling to catch the vibrations of the next compaction cycle. "We have 3 minutes before the next pressure wash," Elias whispered over the comms. "We need to reach the junction box in Sector 82. "Why Sector 82? Kalen asked, her voice strained by the exertion. "Because it's the only place where the waste lines intersect with the fiber optic trunks for the command spire," Elias explained. "The architects were lazy. They bundled the data cables with the plumbing to save on shielding. It's a massive security flaw if you know where to look. They reached the junction, a cavernous space filled with the roar of rushing water and the frantic blinking of 1,000 server lights. Elias moved to a central hub, his fingers working frantically to bypass the physical locks. Kaylin stood guard, her ears suddenly perking up. "Elias, stop." "What?" "The heartbeat," she whispered. "It is not yours. It is rhythmic, mechanical, but it is coming from the walls." Elias froze. He checked his sensor. Nothing on the thermal, nothing on the motion. "The walls," Kaylin insisted. She pressed her ear against a large pulsating conduit that ran toward the command spire. "It is not data, Elias. It is breathing." Elias looked at the conduit. It wasn't made of standard alloy. It was a semi-organic material, a biomechanical hybrid that looked like a vein of dark, translucent muscle. Inside, he could see a faint, rhythmic blue pulse. "The ghost workers," Elias whispered, horror dawning on him. "They aren't in a warehouse. They are the network." Ouroboros hadn't just slaved the refugees' minds to the computer. They had used their very biology to create a living processing unit. The command spire didn't run on silicon. It ran on the stolen neural energy of thousands of Caldari. Kaylin let out a choked sob. Her hand found the conduit, her fingers tracing the rhythmic pulse. "I can hear them, Elias. They are screaming in a frequency humans cannot hear. They are calling for their homes." Elias gripped his pulse rifle so hard his knuckles turned white. The humanistic theme he had tried to bury, the idea that every life had a meaning beyond its utility, roared back into his consciousness. He looked at Kaylin, her face illuminated by the sickly blue light of the living walls. "We aren't just broadcasting a manifest, Kaylin," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "We're cutting the power. We're waking them up. If we wake them all at once, the hub's life support will crash," Kaylin warned. "The station will lose its stability. Then we'd better make sure there are enough life pods for everyone," Elias said. "Kaylin, I need you to interface with this conduit. Use the data spike. Tell them to hold on. Tell them the scrubber is here to clean the system." Kaylin nodded, her silver-streaked fur standing on end. She slot the data spike into the conduit's interface node. As the tool bit into the living tissue, a surge of blue energy raced through the room. Kaylin's eyes flared with a brilliant, blinding light. She let out a cry that was half song, half scream. "They hear me!" she shouted over the roar of the machinery. "They are answering, Elias! The drum is beating again!" Above them, in the command spire, the lights of Ethelgard Hub began to flicker. The red alert sirens changed their tone, shifting from a corporate drone to a wild, chaotic rhythm. The veteran and the scholar stood in the heart of the machine, two broken parts that had finally found where they fit. The layers were gone. The truth was out. And the stars of Golgotha Prime were finally starting to look like an exit. The air in the subspire did not just smell of recycled oxygen. It tasted of a slow, agonizing death. It was a thick, cloying sweetness, like rotting fruit buried under a layer of antiseptic. As Elias Vane and Kaylin Vane moved deeper into the restricted arteries of Sector 82, the walls transitioned from the familiar, cold durasteel into something far more unsettling. The metallic plates were increasingly interrupted by pulses of translucent, vein-like conduits that throbbed with a rhythmic, bioluminescent blue light. Elias adjusted the strap of his pulse rifle, his knuckles white. Every step he took felt like he was walking back into the mud of the Reach colonies. He had spent 10 years trying to convince himself that he was a simple mechanic, a man who fixed fans and ignored the universe. But the deeper they went, the more his deep recon training clawed its way back to the surface. He wasn't looking at walls anymore. He was looking at cover. He wasn't listening for the hum of the station. He was listening for the click of a safety being disengaged. "Stay close, Kaylin," Elias whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp. "If the floor starts to feel soft, keep your weight on the rivets. We are walking on a literal nervous system now." Kaylin didn't respond immediately. She was leaning against one of the pulsating conduits, her large, russet-furred ears pinned flat against her skull. Her eyes were squeezed shut, and her tail was twitching in erratic, jagged patterns. To a human, the room was silent. save for the low-frequency thrum of the station's heart. To a Caldari, the room was a cacophony of agony. "I can hear them," she breathed, her voice barely a thread of sound. "It is not just one heartbeat, Elias. It is hundreds, thousands. They are layered on top of each other, a choir of screams that never reaches the mouth." Elias knelt beside her, his large hand hovering near her shoulder before he pulled it back, unsure if a human touch would help or hinder a linguistic scholar currently drowning in psychic residue. "Kalen, focus on my voice. Don't listen to the walls. We need to reach the primary uplink in the next 20 minutes, or the Stellar Reaper is going to dock, and we'll be trapped in the middle of a tactical offload." Kalen opened her eyes. They were wide, the golden irises clouded with a misty, shimmering film. "One of them," she whispered. "One of the heartbeats. It sounds like my sister's teacher, Old Master Ellen. He disappeared 3 years ago during the resource redistribution on the moon of Valia. They said he had been relocated to a research facility." Elias's jaw tightened. Redistribution, relocation, optimization. Ouroboros Corp had a whole dictionary of words designed to hide the fact that they were treating sentient beings like spare parts for a computer they hadn't finished building. "Listen to me, Kalen," Elias said, grabbing her forearm with a firm, grounding grip. "We can't help them if we're dead. And if we don't get to that array, Jax and Miri are going to end up as just another beat in this wall. You hear me? Focus on the kits." Kalen's ears twitched, then slowly began to rise. The fog in her eyes cleared, replaced by a cold, sharp fire. "The kits," she repeated. "Yes, for the kits. For the—" They moved forward, navigating a forest of bioconduits that grew thicker as they approached the spire. The path was narrow, the floor slick with a clear, viscous fluid that Elias recognized as neural conductive gel. It was the stuff used in stasis tanks to keep brains alive without bodies. They reached a heavy, circular airlock that looked more like a valve than a door. Elias pulled out his data spike, but as he reached for the interface port, he froze. The port wasn't a standard data socket. It was a circular indentation lined with fine, hair-like sensors. "Biometric lock," Elias muttered. "It's looking for an Ouroboros signature. High level." Kalen stepped forward, her tail brushing against the wall. "Give me the spike, Elias." Elias handed it to her. She didn't slot it into the lock. Instead, she pressed the tip of the hexagonal tool against her own integration tag, the epsilon marker at her throat. The tag flared with a dull amber light, emitting a series of high-pitched melodic chirps. "What are you doing?" Elias asked, his hand going to his rifle. "The tags are calibrated to our unique vocal frequencies," Kalen explained, her fingers moving with a scholar's precision. "Ouroboros uses our biology as the key. If I can mimic the resonant frequency of a high-level administrator's vocal ID, the lock will think I am the one it is waiting for." She closed her eyes and began to hum. It was a strange, haunting sound, a sequence of vowels that seemed to vibrate in the very air. As she sang, the blue conduits in the walls began to pulse in time with her voice. The blue light and the amber glow of the tag merged, creating a sickly green radiance that illuminated the terror on her face. The airlock gave a wet, squelching click. The heavy valve spun and retracted, revealing a brightly lit corridor that looked like it belonged in a luxury hospital rather than a space station's underbelly. "We are in," Kalen whispered, her ears drooping from the effort. Elias didn't wait. He stepped through the threshold, his rifle sweeping the hallway. The contrast was jarring. Gone was the biological horror of the conduits, replaced by white marble floors, gold-trimmed panels, and air so pure it made Elias's lungs ache. This was the spire, the home of the Ouroboros elite. The people who breathed the air filtered through the lungs of the Caldari. "Slick," Elias whispered. "Real slick." They moved quickly, ghosting through the shadows of the high-arched corridors. They passed a set of massive, transparent aluminum viewports that offered a breathtaking view of Golgotha Prime. From this height, the storm was no longer a bruised eye. It was a swirling sea of violet clouds, illuminated by lightning bolts that were 3,000 kilometers long. "Look at that," Elias said, pausing for a split second. "A whole world of energy, and these bastards would rather steal the life from a Fox kit than build a better turbine." "It is easier to dominate than to innovate," Elias Vane, Kalen said, her voice bitter. They reached the entrance to the primary communication array. It was a cavernous room filled with towering server stacks that looked like monoliths of black glass. In the center, a holographic representation of the hub's data traffic pulsed with a steady, golden light. Elias moved to the main terminal, his fingers dancing across the keys. He began the upload, the data spike glowing hot as it dumped the stolen manifests and energy logs into the hub's outgoing broadcast buffer. 30%, Elias reported. The file is huge. The encryption is fighting back. Suddenly, the golden hologram in the center of the room turned a violent, flashing red. A voice, cold and synthetic, filled the air. Unauthorized data transfer detected. Security Protocol 9 engaged. Initiating neural purge in Sector 82. Elias's heart skipped a beat. Sector 82. That's where the conduits are. They're going to fry the ghost workers to stop the leak. Kaylin let out a scream of pure agony. She collapsed to the floor, her hands clutching her ears. They are screaming, she cried. The choir! It's on fire! They're burning their minds! Elias grabbed her, trying to pull her away from the floor. Kaylin, I have to finish the upload. If I stop now, everything they've suffered is for nothing. But Kaylin was no longer listening. She was looking past him, toward the doorway. A figure stepped into the light. He was a human male, perhaps 55 years old, wearing the pristine white uniform of a director. He had a face that was engineered for trust, symmetrical features, kind eyes, and a smile that looked like it had never known a day of labor. But it was the man standing behind him that made Elias's blood turn to ice. The second man was younger, clad in the heavy, matte black armor of the Epsilon Logistics Corps. On his shoulder was a patch that Elias hadn't seen in 12 years, a 7th Deep Recon insignia crossed out with a red strike. Vane, the armored man said, his voice a mocking drawl. I heard you were still alive, scrubbing the latrines like a good little soldier. I didn't believe it. I thought you were too stubborn to survive on crumbs. Miller? Elias whispered, his rifle lowering an inch. Miller laughed, a dry, hollow sound. Sergeant Miller to you, scrubber. I took the corporate buyout while you were still staring at the stars and wondering where the extraction ships were. You sold us out, Elias said, the realization hitting him with the force of a kinetic strike. Garrison 9. You were the one who sent the economically non-viable code. Miller shrugged, his gloved hand resting on the grip of a high-output energy carbine. It was a business decision, Elias. The Epsilon fleet was already moving the first batch of processors. We couldn't risk the swarm capturing the tech just to save a few grunts. You were always a sentimental idiot. That's why you're down there with the dust, and I'm up here with the view. The director stepped forward, his smile widening. Sergeant Vane, I am Director Thorne. I must thank you. Your little crusade has actually helped us calibrate the neural load. We were wondering how much stress the Caldari processors could handle before a total system collapse. Your friend here is providing some fascinating data. He pointed to Kaylin, who was still convulsing on the floor, her ears bleeding as the station's security frequency tore through her mind. You bastards, Elias growled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Miller was faster. He raised his carbine and fired a suppression bolt that slammed into the floor at Elias's feet, sending a wave of concussive force that threw the veteran backward. Don't do it, Vane, Miller warned. You're washed. You're 48 years old, your back is shot, and you're fighting for a species that doesn't even like you. Give me the spike, and maybe I'll let the kids in Sector 89 live. Elias looked at the terminal. 60%. He looked at Kaylin, whose heart rate was reaching a terminal spike. He looked at Miller, his brother in arms, the man who had shared his rations on the mud moons, now a polished weapon of the very corporation that had destroyed them. The humanistic theme he had been avoiding for 10 years finally caught up to him. He could either be the soldier he was trained to be, efficient, ruthless, and focused on the mission, or he could be the man Kaylin thought he was, the man who shared his soup. Elias looked Miller in the eye. You know, Miller, there's one thing they didn't teach us in deep recon. What's that? Miller sneered. How to quit, Elias said. He didn't fire at Miller. Instead, he spun and slammed his fist into the main holographic projector. The glass shattered, and Elias shoved his data spike into the exposed circuitry, initiating a manual feedback loop. 80%, Elias roared. Miller fired. A bolt of superheated plasma tore through Elias's shoulder, spinning him around. The smell of singed flesh and scorched fabric filled the air. Elias screamed, but he didn't let go of the spike. Elias! Kaylin's voice pierced through the static. She scrambled to her feet, her movement erratic but purposeful. She lunged at the director, not with a weapon, but with a psychic lash, a focused burst of acoustic energy that sent the man stumbling back into the server stacks. Miller aimed at Kaylin, his face twisted in a sneer. "Goodbye, Vae." "No!" Elias shouted. He threw himself in front of her, his body acting as a human shield for the second time in one night. Miller's second shot hit Elias in the chest, the kinetic force shattering his ribs and sending him crashing into the terminal. The screen flashed a brilliant, blinding green. Upload complete. Broadcast slave to all RIM sector relays. Elias collapsed to the floor, his vision blurring. He could hear the sound of sirens, not the station's red alerts, but the distant, beautiful whine of the Outer Rim Council ships dropping out of hyperspace. The truth was out. The manifests, the names of the ghost workers, the evidence of Miller's betrayal. It was all screaming across the stars. The director screamed in rage as the terminal began to self-destruct. But Kaylin didn't look at him. She fell to her knees beside Elias, her hands pressing against the smoking wound in his chest. "Elias, stay with me," she cried. "Your heart, I can't hear it." Elias looked up at her, a weak, bloody grin on his face. You were right, Kaylin." "About what?" "The view," Elias wheezed, his voice fading. "The stars, they look a hell of a lot better, when they're honest." The lights in the spire began to die as the feedback loop shut down the station's primary power. In the growing darkness, the only thing Kaylin could hear was the fading, broken drum of a man who had finally found a reason to stop ghosting. "Hold on, Scrubber," she whispered, her tears falling onto his scarred skin. "The kits are waiting for dinner." Outside, the storm of Golgotha Prime raged on, but for the first time in 1,000 years, a different kind of light was beginning to break through the clouds. The transition from the blinding white of the spire to the gray, suffocating numbness of a medical stasis field was a journey through 1,000 needles. Elias Vane felt his consciousness drifting in a sea of static. He was back on Garrison 9. He could smell the sulfur of the mortar fire. He could hear the laughter of Miller as they sat in the trenches, trading stories about women they would never see again. Then the laughter turned into the high-pitched whine of a plasma bolt, and Miller was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating face of the man who had shot him in the spire. "Economics, Elias. It's all just economics." Elias's eyes snapped open. He wasn't in a trench. He was in a medical pod, his body encased in a shimmering blue field of regenerative gel. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, and his chest felt like it had been reconstructed with scrap metal and prayer. Through the translucent lid of the pod, he saw a world he didn't recognize. Gone were the polished corridors of Ouroboros. The room he was in was small, cramped, and smelled of something wonderful, real, unrecycled pine needles. "He's awake," a high-pitched voice squeaked. A cream-tipped ear appeared at the edge of his vision. Miri. She was standing on a stool, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with relief. Elias tried to speak, but his throat was full of medical foam. He managed a wet, rattling cough. "Easy, Scrubber," a melodic voice said. "You are still 60% scar tissue and 40% miracle." Kaylin Vae moved into his line of sight. She looked different. She wasn't wearing the rags of a refugee anymore. She wore a clean, dark green flight suit with a silver pin on the collar, the insignia of the Outer Rim Council's humanitarian oversight. Her fur had regained its luster, and her ears were perked up with an authority he had never seen. She tapped a command on the pod, and the blue field dissipated. The lid hissed open, and Elias felt the weight of gravity return to his limbs like a lead blanket. Where are we?" Elias wheezed, his voice sounding like two pieces of sandpaper rubbing together. "Ethelgard Hub," Kaylin said, helping him sit up. "Or what is left of it." "Ouroboros is gone, Elias. The upload you sent, it hit the council relays like an orbital bombardment. They sent 3 heavy frigates to seize the station within 4 hours. Director Thorne is in a high-security brig on the way to the inner sector for trial." "And Miller?" Elias asked, his heart giving a painful thud. Kalen's expression darkened. He fled. He took a stealth shuttle before the council ships arrived. But he won't get far. His biometric signature is flagged across the entire sector. Elias slumped back against the pillows, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The kits? They are here, Kalen said, gesturing to the corner of the room. Jax was sitting at a small table, dismantling what looked like a sophisticated flight computer with a screwdriver. He looked up and gave Elias a sharp, determined nod. He wants to be a pilot for the council, Kalen whispered. He says he needs to learn how to fly so he can find the stars you talked about. Elias looked at his hands. They were trembling. The tremor he had mocked in other humans was finally his own. He felt a sudden, crushing weight in his chest that had nothing to do with broken ribs. I did it, Kalen, Elias said softly. I stopped the choir from burning. Kalen sat on the edge of the bed. She reached out and took his hand. Yes, you woke them up. The council healers are still working on them. Many of them will have long-term damage, but they are breathing. They are people again, not processors. But as she spoke, Elias noticed something. He looked at Kalen's ears. They were still, almost rigid. He looked at the way her tail was tucked tightly against her leg. She was lying to him, or rather, she was omitting the truth. What's the catch, Kalen? Elias asked, his veteran instinct sensing the gap in her story. The Outer Rim Council doesn't just hand out clean flight suits and pine-scented rooms for free. What did it cost? Kalen was silent for a long moment. She looked at the kits, then back at Elias. The hub is being dismantled, Elias. The council determined that the biological contamination of the infrastructure was too deep to repair. They are relocating everyone. The humans to the core worlds, the Caldari to a new settlement on the edge of the rim. And me? You are a hero, Elias. Your pension has been restored. You have enough credits to retire anywhere you want. You could buy that robotic goldfish. You could finally go on that date. Elias looked her in the eye. The humanistic theme of purpose was being tested now, in the quiet of a recovery room. For 10 years, he had wanted exactly this: a way out, a full wallet, and a quiet life where no one knew his name. He had earned his retirement in the blood of his brothers and the grease of the vents. But as he looked at Kalen, he felt a jagged edge of truth cutting through the comfort of his victory. You're not coming with me, are you? Elias asked. Kalen's ears flattened. I am an official witness, Elias. I have a responsibility to my people. I have to help lead the new settlement. The Caldari need a voice that knows how to speak to the humans without screaming. I see, Elias said. He looked at his own reflection in the medical monitor. He looked like a man who had just won a war only to realize he had nowhere to go after the parade. Kalen leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that vibrated in his bones. Elias, before you leave, there is something you need to see. Something I found in the Epsilon archives while the council was processing the data. What? Kalen pulled up a holographic file on her wrist comm. It was a mission log from 12 years ago, Sector Garrison 9. Elias felt the cold return to his marrow. It was not just Miller who betrayed you, Elias, Kalen said, her eyes filling with a profound, terrifying sadness. The order to abandon Garrison 9. It wasn't just about the tech. Ouroboros needed a baseline for the ghost work. They needed combat-hardened human neural patterns to stabilize the Caldari choir. Elias stared at the log. His breath hitched. The life pod you escaped in. It wasn't an accident, Kalen whispered. They let you live. They tracked you for 10 years. Every fan you scrubbed, every vent you crawled through. You were being used to calibrate the station's environmental efficiency. You were part of the machine, Elias, a silent human processor. You weren't hiding from them. You were working for them. The revelation shattered Elias's world more effectively than Miller's plasma bolt. The 10 years of peace he thought he had carved out for himself was a lie. His survival wasn't a triumph of will. It was a corporate oversight. He hadn't been a ghost. He had been a tool. He let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. I spent a decade thinking I was a failure because I lived while my brothers died. Turns out I was just a more efficient piece of hardware. Elias. No, Elias said, pushing her hand away. He stood up, his legs shaking, his heart hammering with a rhythm that felt like a death march. I'm not a hero, Kalen. I'm just more junk. Just another piece of salvage that Ouroboros hasn't thrown away yet. He walked to the window, looking out at the hub. In the distance, he could see the salvage tugs beginning to strip the outer rings. The station that had been his cage, his home, and his identity was being dismantled, piece by piece. The cost of the light was the realization that he was still in the dark. Kalen walked up behind him. She didn't touch him this time. She didn't need to. She just listened to the broken, jagged drum of his heart. You are wrong, Elias Vane, she said. How? A tool does not choose to share its soup, Kalen said softly. A processor does not jump in front of a plasma bolt to save a linguistic scholar. Ouroboros might have designed your survival, but they did not design your soul. You chose to protect us. You chose to be a father to my kits when you had every reason to be a ghost. Elias turned to face her. The salt and pepper hair, the grease-stained skin, the eyes that had seen the end of the world, they were all still there. But the look in his eyes had changed. The cynical armor was gone, leaving behind a man who was terrified of his own meaning. What do I do now, Kalen? Elias asked, his voice breaking. I don't know how to be a person. I only know how to be a soldier or a scrubber. Kalen reached out and took his hand. Her grip was warm, furred, and steady. Then be both, she said. The new settlement. It's a wilderness, Elias. We have no infrastructure, no security, no one who knows how to fix an air recycler with a roll of tape and a prayer. We need a man who knows how to build a world from the junk. Elias looked at her hand, then at the kits. Jax was watching him, holding out the screwdriver as if it were a scepter. Mary was wiggling her ears, her eyes bright with a hope that Elias had thought was extinct in this sector. It's 5,000 light-years away, Elias said, his voice regaining some of its gravelly strength. It's cold, it's dangerous, and I'm pretty sure the rations will taste like chalk. Kalen smiled, her sharp teeth catching the light. As long as we do not have to eat them alone, I think we can handle it. Elias Vane looked out at the storm of Golgotha Prime one last time. He thought of his date who didn't come. He thought of the 40 men on Garrison 9. He thought of Miller drifting in the dark. He didn't feel like a ghost anymore. He felt like a man who was finally, for the first time in his life, deciding where to put his boots. All right, slick, Elias said, a real smile finally reaching his eyes. Pack the kits. We're moving. But I'm warning you, if I find a robotic cat in the luggage, I'm airlocking it. Kalen laughed, a sound that resonated in Elias's chest like a heartbeat he could finally live with. The scrubber and the scholar walked out of the room, two survivors of a war that had tried to turn them into machines, heading toward a frontier that didn't have a manifest yet. The stars were still honest, and for the first time in 10 years, Elias Vane was ready to talk back to them. Outside, the first transport pod began its journey toward the rim. The journey was long, 3,000 light-years of empty space. Nut in the quiet of the cabin, 4 hearts were beating in a rhythm that the Ouroboros algorithms could never ever predict. The lesson was simple, though it had taken Elias 48 years to learn it. You are never just salvage. You are the one who decides what stays broken and what gets to be born again. The planet Vaelia-Four did not welcome its new guests with open arms. It greeted them with a sandstorm that tasted of iron and ancient, unfulfilled promises. It was a world of jagged obsidian ridges and vast, shivering plains of copper grass that sang when the wind caught it. A haunting, metallic melody that echoed the very frequencies the Caldari were born to perceive. They had named their new settlement Ethel Vale, a clumsy synthesis of the station that had been their prison and the homeworld that was now a memory of ash. Elias Vane stood on the ramp of the transport vessel, his boots sinking into the fine red dust. He adjusted the heavy filter mask over his face, feeling the familiar, rhythmic thrum of the hub's recycled air being replaced by the raw, oxygen-rich lung burn of a wild world. It had been 3 months since the fall of Ouroboros Corp, and the journey to the rim had been a blur of crowded corridors, leaking fuel lines, and the constant, nagging ache in his reconstructed chest. "Move it, scrubber! You're blocking the flow!" A human voice barked from behind him. It was Miller's old replacement, a man named Holloway who had the tactical sense of a stunned goldfish, but the ego of a fleet admiral. Elias didn't move. He let his eyes scan the horizon, his deep recon training overlaying the landscape with grids of engagement zones and extraction points. Old habits were not just hard to die, they were his skeletal structure. "The ground is soft, Holloway," Elias said, his voice muffled by the mask, but still carrying that gravelly authority. "If you drop that power core here, it'll sink 3 meters before you can say optimization. Use the stabilizers on the landing struts." Holloway rolled his eyes, but he signaled the droids to wait. "You're a civilian now, Vane. Try acting like one. Maybe go find a rock to sit on and talk to your fox friends." Elias ignored him. He stepped off the ramp and toward a cluster of Caldari refugees who were huddled near the primary irrigation node. Kaylin Vey was there, her russet fur matted with dust, her hands buried in the guts of a malfunctioning water vaporizer. She looked up as he approached, her ears swiveling to track his heartbeat. "It is out of phase, Elias," she said, her voice strained. "The acoustic resonance of the planet is interfering with the pump's internal oscillators. It sounds like it is screaming." Elias knelt beside her, pulling a worn magnetic wrench from his belt. He didn't need a diagnostic screen to know what was wrong. He could feel it in the vibrations of the machine. The pump was a piece of corporate surplus, designed for the sterile environment of a laboratory, not the grit and chaos of a frontier world. "It's not screaming, Kaylin," Elias said, tapping the casing with methodical precision. "It's just confused. It thinks the wind is a security override. We need to dampen the housing with some of that lead lining from the transport scrap bin." He worked in silence for 20 minutes, his hands moving with a fluid, unconscious grace. Kaylin watched him, her tail flicking idly against the red earth. "You have changed, Elias," she said softly. "The rhythm of your heart. It is no longer a drum in the rain. It is a forge. Hotter, more purposeful." "It's just the gravity," Elias grunted, though he knew she could hear the lie. "Heavier planet, harder work. Don't go reading poetry into my biology." "I do not need to read poetry when I can hear the truth," she countered. She reached out and touched the sleeve of his jacket, near the shoulder where Miller's plasma bolt had left a star-shaped scar. "You could have stayed in the core, Elias. You could have lived in a room with a view of a fake ocean and never breathed dust again. Why are you here, knee-deep in the mud with a species that most of your kind considers a line item in a ledger?" Elias stilled. He looked at Jax and Miri, who were a few yards away, trying to teach a group of human children how to track the vibrations of a burrowing sand crab. Miri was laughing, her cream-colored ears perking up every time the sand shifted. "I spent 20 years following the wrong orders, Kaylin," Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was lost to everyone but her. "I helped glass planets. I helped clear obstructions so corporations could build monuments to greed. I told myself it was just a job, that I was just a cog. But when I saw you in that restaurant, splitting that roll, I realized that a cog doesn't get to choose who it grinds. A man does." He tightened the final bolt on the pump. The machine let out a low, satisfied hum, its vibrations smoothing out into a steady pulse. "I'm not here to be a hero," Elias continued, standing up and wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "I'm here because I'm a scrubber, and this galaxy is a mess. I figure I owe it a few decades of cleaning up." Kaylin stood with him, her golden eyes shining with a mixture of respect and a lingering, haunting sorrow. "The work will be hard, Elias. Ouroboros is gone, but the serpent's fang remains. The splinter groups, they do not forgive the loss of their processors." "Let them come," Elias said, his gaze shifting back to the black obsidian ridges. "I've got a whole workshop full of junk and a family that knows how to listen to the walls. We're not salvage anymore." The next week was a lesson in the brutal physics of the rim. Ethel Vale was a world that demanded a tax in sweat and blood for every centimeter of progress. The air recyclers clogged with iron dust every 12 hours. The solar arrays were battered by localized ion squalls that turned the sky into a strobe light of violet energy. Elias became the settlement's unofficial heart. He didn't lead. He wasn't interested in titles, but he was always there when something broke. He taught the Caldari how to reinforce their yurts with discarded hull plates. He showed the human settlers how to filter the copper grass toxins using nothing but charcoal and a prayer. But the peeling layer structure of his life was not done with him yet. On the 14th rotation, Elias was deep in the sublevel of the settlement's primary power station, trying to stabilize a leaking coolant pipe. He had his neural interface slaved to the station's local net, a habit he couldn't break despite the risks. He was searching for a pressure leak when he stumbled upon a ghost signal. It was an encrypted data packet buried in the background radiation of the planet's magnetic field. It was using a seventh deep recon cipher. Elias's hands began to shake. He pulled up the packet, his vision fracturing into cascading lines of green code. Target, Ethel Vale. Status, reclamation pending. Asset code, Alpha Garrison 9. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. Alpha Garrison 9 wasn't a location. It was a project code, his project code. He dug deeper, his mind racing through the firewalls like a frantic animal. He found the source of the neural anchor technology. He found the original research papers from Epsilon Logistics. And there, at the very bottom of the data stream, was a neural map of a human brain. The baseline, the source code for the subsonic pulses that had paralyzed Kaylin and her kits. The map belonged to him. 12 years ago, after he had been rescued from Garrison 9, Ouroboros hadn't just healed him. While he was in the medical stasis field, they had mapped his trauma. They had recorded the specific frequency of his fear, the rhythm of his grief, and the neural spikes of his guilt. They had realized that the deep recon mental state, the hyper-vigilant, combat-ready focus, was the perfect carrier wave for controlling the Caldari's sensitive acoustic biology. The anchor that had turned Kaylin into a processor was built from the wreckage of Elias Vane's soul. He let out a choked, horrific sound. He ripped the interface jack from the base of his skull, his head throbbing with a sudden, blinding migraine. The pipe he had been fixing began to hiss, spraying cold coolant across his face, but he didn't feel it. "I am the leash," Elias whispered into the dark. "I am the reason they can't run." The irony was a jagged blade in his gut. He had spent the last few weeks feeling like he was finding a purpose, like he was earning his place in this family. But the truth was that his very presence was a biological blueprint for their enslavement. Ouroboros hadn't just used him as a tool, they had turned his suffering into a weapon. "Elias," Kaylin was standing at the top of the maintenance ladder, her silhouette framed by the harsh orange light of the twin suns. She climbed down slowly, her ears perking up as she sensed the sudden, violent shift in the room's energy. "The resonance in here, it is wrong," she said, her voice full of concern. "Your heart, Elias, it is beating like a dying star. What did you find?" Elias backed away into the shadows, his face pale and slick with coolant. "Don't come any closer, Kaylin. Just get the kits, get to the transport. You need to leave Vaelia-Four." "What are you talking about? The settlement is finally stable. We are building a home." "There is no home for you here," Elias shouted, the raw pain tearing out of his throat. "Miller didn't just escape, Kaylin. He's coming back, and he's coming for me, because I'm the source code, the neural anchors, the frequency that burns your minds. It was modeled on my brainwaves. I'm the blueprint for the leash." Kaylin froze. The silence that followed was more agonizing than the storm outside. Her ears flattened and her tail went rigid. She could hear the truth vibrating in the air, the cold, clinical reality of his confession. "You," she whispered, "the peace I felt when I was near you, the rhythm I thought was protection. It was just the frequency of the anchor?" "I didn't know," Elias pleaded, his voice breaking. "I swear to you I didn't know they did it. I thought I was just salvage. I thought I was just a broken soldier they forgot to kill." Kaylin backed away, her golden eyes filling with a profound, terrifying betrayal. "Every time you touched my kits, every time you sat at our table, you were broadcasting the very signal that destroyed our world. You are not a guardian, Elias Vane. You are a walking prison." "Kaylin, please, do not use my name," she hissed, her teeth bared in a feral snarl. "I heard your heart, and I thought it sounded like redemption, but it was just the echo of a cage." She turned and scrambled up the ladder, her movement frantic and pained. Elias stayed in the darkness of the subfloor, the cold coolant dripping from his chin like tears. He had peeled the final layer, and there was nothing left underneath but the ghost of the man he had tried to kill 10 years ago. The transformation he had hoped for was a lie. He wasn't a builder. He was just the scrubber who had found the dirt was inside him all along. But then a new sound pierced the silence. Not a heartbeat, not a machine. It was the high-pitched screaming whine of a descent thruster. Elias lunged for the terminal, his fingers acting on a decade of muscle memory. He brought up the orbital sensors. Two black-wing gunships, bearing the Serpent's Fang insignia, were banking over the obsidian ridges. They weren't landing at the docks. They were heading straight for the power station. "Miller," Elias growled, his eyes clearing as the soldier replaced the man. He didn't have time for guilt. He didn't have time for Kalen's hatred. The hounds were here, and they were looking for their source code. Elias grabbed his pulse rifle and slung it over his shoulder. He looked at the leaking pipe, then at the ladder. He had one chance to change the ending of this manifest. "All right, Slick," he whispered, his voice steadying into a cold geometric precision. "Time to see if the leash can bite the hand that holds it." The first kinetic strike hit the settlement at 1900 hours, precisely when the twin suns were dipping behind the glass peaks. The impact wasn't a loud explosion. It was a rhythmic, pulsing thud that sent a shockwave through the copper grass, turning the metallic song of the planet into a jagged, discordant screech. Inside the primary power station, Elias Vane was thrown against a server rack. The migraine at the base of his skull intensified, a high-frequency ringing that felt like a hot needle being driven into his brain. He knew that sound. It wasn't an atmospheric breach. It was a broad-spectrum neural anchor broadcast, amplified by the gunship's massive emitters. Across the settlement, he could hear the result. The screams of the Kaldari refugees didn't rise. They were smothered by the frequency. It was a collective, agonizing gasp as thousands of nervous systems were slaved to the subsonic pulse. Elias scrambled to his feet, his vision tunneling. He checked his wristcom. The source code packet was still active. He could see his own neural patterns being used as the carrier wave for the assault. Every spike of his own adrenaline was feeding the broadcast, making the leash tighter for Kalen and her people. "System override," Elias wheezed, his fingers fumbling with his data spike. "Identify user. Vane, Elias, Sergeant, 7th Deep Recon. Authorization code, Broken Arrow Garrison 9. Authorization confirmed. Accessing neural carrier parameters. Phase shift the output," Elias commanded, his teeth gritting against the pain. "If I'm the blueprint, then I'm the only one who can change the frequency. Slant the wave. Turn the anchor into a shield. Warning, neural feedback levels exceed safety protocols. Total cognitive collapse probable." "I'm a scrubber, you piece of junk," Elias roared at the console. "I've been surviving on toxic fumes for a decade. Do it." The gunships hovered like black vultures over the central plaza. The ramp of the lead vessel hissed open, and Sergeant Miller stepped out, clad in a new suit of kinetic reactive armor that shimmered like oil on water. He held a heavy sonic cannon, his face twisted in a look of triumphant boredom. "Vane, I know you're in there." Miller's voice boomed over the gunship's external speakers. "Stop trying to play hero and come out. The board wants their intellectual property back, and you're the only copy we've got left. Give me the Vixen and the kits, and maybe I'll let you die in a bed instead of a lab tank." At the edge of the plaza, Kalen Vay lay in the red dust, her body twitching in time with the subsonic pulse. Jax and Miri were huddled under her tail, their ears bleeding, their eyes glazed with the terrifying submission of the anchor. "Look at them, Elias," Miller laughed. "They're not people. They're just hardware. And you're the operating system. Come on out and let's finish the reboot." Inside the power station, Elias was strapped into the maintenance chair, his neural port connected directly to the station's primary oscillator. The room was bathed in a violent, flickering purple light. His body was arching in the chair, his muscles seizing as he forced his own consciousness into the broadcast stream. He wasn't just fixing a fan anymore. He was rewriting his own history. He thought of the 40 men on Garrison 9. He thought of the moment the extraction ships warped away. He thought of the decade of whiskey and silence. But most of all, he thought of the chocolate malt on Miri's whiskers, and the way Kalen had listened to his heart and heard a man instead of a tool. Redemption isn't a destination, Elias gasped, his blood beginning to boil in his veins. It's a choice. He slammed his hand onto the execute command. Outside, the air suddenly vibrated with a sound that wasn't a scream or a hum. It was a chord, a massive harmonic resonance that combined a human's defiance with a Caldere's song. The purple light of the anchor broadcast was swallowed by a brilliant, shimmering white dome that erupted from the power station. The shield. The effect was instantaneous. The Caldari refugees who had been pinned to the ground by agony suddenly felt the pressure lift. The subsonic pulse didn't vanish. It transformed. It became a frequency of calm, of focus, of fierce, unwavering strength. Kaylin Vay's eyes snapped open. The fog was gone. She stood up, her russet fur standing on end, her ears perked up so high they looked like blades. She could hear the new rhythm, the forged beat of Elias Vane's heart, amplified through the station's towers. It wasn't a cage anymore. It was a call to arms. "He is not the leash," Kaylin whispered, her voice melodic and dangerous. "He is the bell." She looked at Miller, who was staring in shock as his sonic cannon began to whine with feedback. "Caldari!" Kaylin's voice rang across the plaza, amplified by the resonance. "The scrubber has cleared the air. The anchor is broken. Take back your world." The refugees didn't need a second command. They moved with the fluid, predatory grace of a species that had been suppressed for too long. They didn't have rifles, but they had industrial tools and the absolute unity of the frequency Elias was broadcasting. Jack scrambled to his feet, grabbing a magnetic wrench. "For the stars!" He shouted, leading a group of kits toward the gunship's landing struts. Miller panicked. He raised his cannon, but the weapon was useless against the harmonic shield Elias had created. "Vane, you're killing yourself for them. They'll still hate you. You're a war criminal, Elias." Inside the station, Elias was fading. His vision was black, and he could feel his neural pathways frying one by one. The source code was burning out, but he didn't stop. He held the frequency with the same stubbornness he had used to hold the ridge on Garrison 9. He felt a presence in his mind, a touch, not a human touch, but a vibration of sound and soul. Elias. It was Kaylin. She was using the resonance to speak directly to his heart. "I hear you, Elias Vane. I hear the man you chose to be. The cage is empty. Do not let yourself burn in the ruins." "Got to finish the job," Elias whispered, his heart skipping beats now. "Scrub the system." "No," Kaylin's voice echoed in the void. "You have done enough. You are not salvage. You are our guardian. Come back to the table." With a final desperate surge of will, Elias triggered a massive EMP pulse through the station's grid. A blinding flash of blue energy erupted from the power tower, racing across the settlement. The gunship's electronics sputtered and died. The vessels groaned and tilted, their thrusters failing as they crashed into the obsidian ridges outside the perimeter. Miller's armor seized up, locking him in a chrome coffin in the middle of the plaza. The silence that followed was absolute. Elias slumped forward in the chair, the interface cable falling from his neck with a dull thud. The purple lights were gone. The sirens were quiet. The only sound in the power station was the slow, ragged breathing of a man who had finally scrubbed his soul clean. He waited for the darkness to take him, but instead he felt a warm, furred hand on his cheek. He opened his eyes. Kaylin was there, her face streaked with dust and blood, her ears drooping with exhaustion. Behind her, Jax and Miri were peeking around the server racks, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and adoration. "Did we win?" Elias wheezed. Kaylin smiled, a genuine, beautiful expression that made the twin suns of Vaelia-Four look dim. "The serpent's fang is broken, Elias. Miller is in a container, and the people, they are breathing real air." Elias looked at his hands. They were still trembling, but the tremor didn't feel like a defect anymore. It felt like life. "I'm sorry, Kaylin," he whispered, "about the anchor, about the blueprint." Kaylin leaned down and pressed her forehead against his. The acoustic resonance between them was perfect, two broken hearts finding a common rhythm. "The blueprint was made by Ouroboros," she said, "but the song was yours, Elias Vane. and it is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. Miri crawled into Elias's lap, wrapping her tail around his wrist. Are we going to have dinner now, Mr. Elias? I'm really hungry. Elias let out a weak, rattling laugh. He looked at the family he had fought for, the family he had died for, and the family that had brought him back to life. Yeah, kid, Elias said, his voice regaining its sarcastic spark. But no more broth. I think we've earned a whole basket of rolls, and maybe some of that chocolate malt if the synthesizer didn't explode. The veteran stood up, leaning on the scholar for support. The transformation was painful, and the scars would never truly fade. But as they walked out into the orange twilight of Ethel Vale, Elias Vane realized he wasn't a ghost anymore. He was the man who had decided that the future was worth the junk. The silence that followed the massive electromagnetic pulse was a physical weight, heavier and more suffocating than the iron-rich dust of Vaelia-Four. It was a silence that did not merely signify the absence of noise. It was the sound of 1,000 psychic leashes snapping at once. For the Caldari, it was a collective intake of breath, the first one taken in freedom after decades of rhythmic, artificial anxiety. For Elias Vane, it was the sound of his own mind finally shutting down, the overtaxed neural pathways flickering like a dying power grid before plunging into a merciful, velvet darkness. When Elias finally clawed his way back to consciousness, the first thing he felt was the taste of copper and the sharp, clinical sting of a regenerative stasis field. His head felt like it had been used as a punching bag by a heavy-duty hydraulic press. Every blink was an act of tactical effort. You are awake, a voice said. It was not Kalen. Elias turned his head slowly, the movement sending a cascade of white-hot needles down his spine. He was in the makeshift medical bay of the settlement, but it had been transformed. The rusted walls had been draped in silver-woven fabric, and the humming of corporate surplus machines had been replaced by the elegant, melodic chirping of Caldari medical tech. Sitting in a chair beside the pod was a human woman with hair the color of hammered platinum and a gaze that could cut through the reinforced ferroglass. Ambassador Haddad. Behind her, 2 Outer Rim Council investigators stood with their arms crossed, looking like they were trying to decide if Elias was a hero or a hazardous spill. Ambassador, Elias wheezed, his voice sounding like 2 pieces of dry flint rubbing together. How long? 2 rotations, Sergeant Vane, Haddad replied. She didn't call him scrubber. She didn't call him a civilian. You've been through a neural burn that would have vaporized a man half your age. The Caldari healers insisted on managing your recovery. They said your heart had a specific rhythm they needed to harmonize with. Elias looked at his hands. They were pale, the grease stains finally washed away by the medical gel, leaving only the pale, crisscrossing scars of his history. Kalen? The kits? They are safe, Haddad said, leaning forward. The Serpent's Fang gunships are scrap metal. We've secured the site, and the Council has officially revoked Ouroboros Corp's mining charter for this entire sector. The evidence you broadcasted, it didn't just start a fire, Vane. It triggered a supernova. 12 corporate directors are already in detention pods, and Miller is currently being held in a lead-line container in the Central Plaza. Elias let out a long, ragged breath. The anchor was broken. The ghost work was over, but the weight in his chest, the realization that his own trauma had been the blueprint for the Caldari's enslavement, felt heavier than any corporate debt. They know, don't they? Elias asked, staring at the ceiling. Kalen, she knows what I am. Haddad was silent for a moment. She knows you were the baseline. She also knows you were the one who chose to slant the wave. The Council is still debating the legalities of your involvement in the original Epsilon research, but the Caldari, they aren't interested in the law right now. I bet, Elias muttered. They probably want my head on a pike. I'm the blueprint for the leash. Slick. I'm the monster in the machine. Is that what you think you are? The voice came from the doorway. Kalen Vane stepped into the room. She looked exhausted, her russet fur matted and her eyes shadowed with a profound, lingering grief. But her ears were perked up, tracking the room with a sharp, renewed focus. The ambassador and the investigators stood up, giving her space. In the eyes of the Rim, Kalen was no longer a refugee. She was the voice of a liberated people. Kaylin walked to the side of the pod. She didn't look at the ambassador. She only looked at Elias. The investigators want to take Miller back to the Corps for trial, Kaylin said, her voice a low, vibrating melody. They want him to testify against the board. But my people, they want him to face the silence of the copper grass. Elias struggled to sit up, the stasis gel dripping from his shoulders. Miller is a rat, Kaylin. He'll trade every secret he has for a comfortable cell. If you give him to the council, you get the truth. If you give him to the grass, you just get another ghost. He killed 17 of your brothers, Elias, Kaylin said. He turned your soul into a weapon to burn my children's minds. Why do you still speak for his life? Because if we kill him out of spite, we're just another part of the Ouroboros machine, Elias said, his voice regaining some of its sergeant's rasp. The scrubbers rule, remember? You don't fix a system by smashing the parts. You fix it by removing the dirt. Miller is the dirt. Let the council wash him away. Kaylin searched his face. Her ears twitched, listening to the erratic, fluttering beat of his heart. She saw the man who had shared his soup. She saw the soldier who had held the ridge. And she saw the baseline for her own suffering, now broken and bleeding in a medical tank. He says he wants to see you, Kaylin whispered, one last time, before the transport pods launch. The central plaza of Ethel Vale was a theater of raw, unfiltered emotion. Hundreds of Caldari stood in a wide circle, their tails still, their ears swiveling in a unified, haunting chorus of low-frequency humming. In the center, a heavy lead-lined containment unit sat in the red dust. Inside, visible through a small, reinforced viewport, was Sergeant Miller. He had been stripped of his kinetic reactive armor. He wore the gray, shapeless tunic of a prisoner, and his face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. Without the top brass backing and the high-grade tech, he looked small. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who had sold his humanity for a view of a fake ocean. Elias Vane approached the container, leaning heavily on a staff made of salvaged hydraulic piping. Kaylin walked beside him, a silent sentinel of russet and silver. Miller saw him. He lunged at the glass, his hands clawing at the surface. Vane, you have to tell them. Tell them it was the board. I was just following the optimization protocols. You know how it is. We were grunts. We were just doing the work. Elias stopped a foot from the glass. He looked at Miller, the man he had once called brother, the man who had shared a trench on Garrison 9. He didn't feel rage. He didn't even feel the urge to punch the glass. He just felt an overwhelming, weary pity. The work is over, Miller, Elias said. His voice was low, but in the silence of the plaza, it carried to the furthest edge of the crowd. There are no more grunts. There's just people who chose to look away, and people who didn't. You're one of us, Elias, Miller shrieked, his voice cracking. You're the source code. You're the reason this whole sector works. You can't leave me here with these mutts. They'll tear me apart. The humming of the Caldari circle intensified, a sound like a swarm of bees preparing for a hive strike. Kaylin's ears flattened, her teeth bared in a silent, feral snarl. Elias turned to face the crowd. He didn't look at Kaylin. He looked at the refugees, the mothers holding kits, the old men with scarred ears, the weavers whose hands had been forced to process corporate data. I am the source code, Elias said, his voice trembling but steady. I am the man whose trauma Ouroboros used to build your cages. Every nightmare I had in the dark was a pulse that burned your minds. I can't scrub that away. I can't fix what I was. He looked back at Miller. But I can choose what I am now. He reached out and tapped a command into the containment unit's interface. The lead shielding on the viewport retracted, exposing Miller fully to the gaze of the Caldari. This man is not a soldier, Elias told the crowd. He is a coward who thinks that economics is a shield for cruelty. If you kill him here, in the red dust, you are only proving that the anchor worked. You are proving that the only thing left in your hearts is the frequency of fear I broadcasted for 10 years. He looked at Kaylin. Is that the baseline we're building this world on, Kaylin? Or are we going to build something that isn't a cage? Kaylin stood rigid, her golden eyes fixed on Miller. The man in the box whimpered, pressing himself against the far wall of the container. The Caldari refugees moved forward, a wave of russet and silver fur, their claws clicking against the metal floor of the plaza. For a heartbeat, Elias thought he had failed. He thought the resonance of mercy wasn't strong enough to drown out the echoes of a decade of pain. Then Mary stepped out from the crowd. The little girl, her cream-tipped ears perking up in the sunlight, walked to the containment unit. She didn't look at Miller with hatred. She didn't look at him with fear. She simply reached out a small, furred paw and touched the glass. "It is okay," she whispered, her voice carrying through the acoustic resonance of the plaza. "The bad noise is gone. We don't have to be loud anymore." The humming of the crowd abruptly stopped. The tension in the plaza snapped, replaced by a sudden, jarring intake of breath. One by one, the Caldari began to step back. The claws retracted. The ears rose. The mutt slang that Miller had used felt suddenly trivial, a small, ugly word in the face of a child's simple grace. Kaylin let out a choked sob. She turned to Elias and buried her face in his chest, her tail wrapping tightly around his leg. "He goes to the council," she whispered. "Let them judge the dirt. We have a world to clean." Elias wrapped his arm around her, holding her with the same protective strength he had used in the spire. He looked over her head at Jax, who was standing nearby, holding his magnetic wrench like a soldier's rifle. The boy gave him a sharp, respectful nod, the salute of a pilot who had found his stars. The council investigators moved in, securing the container and prepping the transport pods. Miller was dragged away, his screams of optimization and contracts fading into the metallic song of the planet. As the ships took off, punching holes in the violet clouds of Vaelia-Four, Elias stood in the center of the plaza. He was a veteran, a scrubber, and a war criminal. He was the blueprint for a leash and the resonance of a shield. But as Mary took his hand, her ears wiggling in the wind, Elias Vane realized that the most important OOPS protocol he had ever triggered was the one that allowed him to be a person again. "Come on, scrubber," Kaylin said, wiping her eyes and pulling him toward the settlement's central yurt. "The irrigation pumps are still making that terrible screeching sound, and Jack says he wants to know how to fix a thruster leak with nothing but a protein bar wrapper." Elias grinned, a real, jagged, beautiful smile. "Tell the kid to get his toolkit slick. We've got a lot of junk to repurpose." The ghosts of the rim were still there, drifting in the shadows of the obsidian ridges. But for the first time in 12 years, Elias Vane wasn't one of them. He was grounded. He was home. And for a man who had spent a decade ghosting the universe, that was the most radical act of rebellion he could imagine. 6 months had passed since the day the copper grass of Vaelia-Four sang with the resonance of mercy. The red dust still tasted of iron, and the twin suns still baked the landscape into a shimmering haze of heat. But Ethel Vale was no longer a collection of shipping containers and desperate prayers. It had become a living, breathing testament to the idea that the most broken parts of the universe could be repurposed into something beautiful. Elias Vane stood on the roof of his newly constructed workshop, a sprawling structure made of fused silica and the salvaged hull plates of the Stellar Reaper. He was no longer wearing the gray maintenance jacket of an Ouroboros scrubber. Instead, he wore a tunic of dark, hand-woven Caldari silk, reinforced with patches of human-made ballistic weave. It was a suit of armor designed not for war, but for the labor of a life chosen. He held a sophisticated acoustic calibrator in his hand, his eyes scanning the horizon. Across the valley, the settlement's primary power towers rose like silver needles into the violet sky. They weren't just turbines anymore. They were harmonic oscillators. Every time the wind caught the copper grass, the towers converted the vibrations into a steady, clean energy that powered the heaters, the recyclers, and the schools. "Elias, you are brooding again. It is unbecoming of a guardian." He didn't need to turn around to know it was Kaylin. He could hear the specific, playful rhythm of her heartbeat, a melody that had become the background track to his every waking moment. "I'm not brooding, Kaylin," Elias grunted, though he was smiling as she climbed the ladder and stepped onto the roof beside him. "I'm assessing the structural integrity of the eastern array. The ion squalls are supposed to kick up again in 4 hours. If the stabilizers aren't synced, the whole grid is going to sound like a Tellarite with a hangover." Kaylin laughed, a sound that resonated in Elias's chest like a warm current. She looked radiant. Her fur was thick and lustrous, and the silver streaks around her muzzle seemed to catch the light of the twin suns like threads of starlight. She was now the head of the Cultural Linguistics Institute of Ethelvale, a place where humans and Caldari studied the ways their biologies could harmoniously coexist. "The children are waiting for you, Elias," she said, leaning against his shoulder. Jax finished his first solo simulation in the scout ship. He says he did it in 42 minutes. He wants you to verify the flight logs because he thinks the computer is optimizing his achievements. 42 minutes? Elias raised an eyebrow. That junk mud is getting too fast for his own good. I'll have to sabotage his thrusters next time, just to keep him humble. And Mary? She's in the garden, Kaylin said, her ears perking up. She found a way to use the neural anchor frequencies, the low-intensity ones, to stimulate the growth of the fire lilies. She says the flowers like to dance to the sound of your heart, Elias. Elias stilled, his hand resting on the calibrator. The fire lilies were a species that had been extinct on the Caldari homeworld since the wars began. They required a specific nurturing vibration to bloom, a frequency of absolute safety, that Mary had used the very technology of their enslavement to bring life back to a dead world, was the kind of poetic justice that made Elias's eyes burn with a sudden, unexpected moisture. I spent 48 years thinking the universe was a machine that only knew how to break things, Kaylin, Elias said softly. I thought I was just a part that had fallen out of the gears. I spent a decade scrubbing fans because I didn't think I was worth the air they were filtering. He turned to look at her, his large, scarred hand taking hers. But I was wrong. The universe isn't a machine, it's a workshop, and we're not the parts, we're the scrubbers. We're the ones who decide what's worth saving. Kaylin leaned her head against his chest, her ears wiggling as she listened to the steady, forge-like beat of his heart. You are more than a scrubber, Elias Vane. You are the anchor that does not hold us back, but keeps us steady in the storm. The transformation in Elias was not a sudden event, but a slow, methodical reconstruction. He still had the nightmares. Garrison 9 would always be a crater in his memory, but they no longer controlled his pulse. He had learned that redemption was not an act of forgetting, but an act of repurposing. He had taken his guilt, his trauma, and his military precision, and he had turned them into a shield for a family that didn't share his DNA, but shared his soul. He demonstrated this transformation not through grand speeches, but through the calluses on his fingers. He spent his days teaching Jax the difference between a tactical retreat and a strategic withdrawal. He spent his evenings sitting with Mary in the garden, letting her listen to his heart until the fire lilies turned a brilliant, triumphant crimson. He was a man who had finally found where he fit in the manifest. The settlement of Ethelvale was not a utopia. There were still disagreements over grain tariffs, still the occasional shadow of Ouroboros splinter groups on the long-range sensors, and the red dust still got into everything. But in the center of the plaza, where the containment unit had once sat, there was now a communal table. It was a long, sturdy thing made of fused obsidian and copperwood. And every evening, at 1900 hours, Elias Vane sat at that table with a linguistic scholar and two fox kits who called him Dad when they thought he wasn't listening. They shared their meals, they argued over the physics of the stars, and they laughed until the twin suns vanished behind the glass peaks. Elias looked out over his world, a world built from junk, held together by trust, and powered by the resonance of mercy. He thought of his date who never came, and he whispered a silent thank you to the ghost of Director Mororo, because she had tried to use his loneliness as a tactical anchor, and in doing so, she had accidentally anchored him to the only thing that mattered. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was the baseline for a new kind of life. I spent 20 years in the mud of the Reach, following orders that felt like lead in my boots. I watched worlds burn and called it securing the perimeter. I told myself that I was a soldier, a tool, a cog in a machine that was too big to fight and too cold to care. When the war ended and Ouroboros tossed me aside like a stripped gear, I accepted it. I thought I earned the silence. I thought scrubbing the grease off corporate fans was the only way to pay for the blood I had on my hands. I spent a decade ghosting my own life, waiting for the oxygen to run out so I could finally stop pretending that I was still alive. But then I sat at a table with a fox and her kits. I saw a mother dividing a bread roll into 3 equal pieces, and I realized that I had been looking at viability all wrong. The corporations, the military, the board. They think viability is about profit margins and neural efficiency. They think the universe is just a manifest of assets to be optimized. They're wrong. Viability is the way Miri's ears wiggle when she's happy. It's the way Jax looks at a flight simulator like it's a doorway to the divine. It's the way Kaylin listens to the rhythm of my broken heart and finds a song worth singing. I spent my life breaking things, and then I spent 10 years hiding in the wreckage. I didn't know how to build. I didn't know how to be a father. I didn't even know how to be a friend. But I learned that you don't need a blueprint to be a person. You just need a toolkit and someone to sit across the table from you. I used to think I was the source code for a cage. Now I know I'm just the architecture for a home. The scars are still there. The ghosts haven't left. But for the first time in 48 years, I'm not running from them. I'm building right on top of them. And that is the only kind of victory that counts. I spent a lifetime believing that my past was a weight that would eventually pull me into the dark, an anchor made of mistakes that I could never cut loose. I thought I was defined by the orders I followed and the things I failed to fix. But I found a family that looked at my scars and saw a guardian instead of a ghost. They taught me that our history isn't a cage. It's just the raw material for what we choose to build next. I wonder, what are the anchors in your own life? Is there a mistake or a memory you've been carrying like a corporate debt, thinking it makes you non-viable? What would happen if you stopped trying to scrub it away and instead used it to build a shield for someone else? What kind of world could you create from the junk you've been trying to hide? The twin suns of Vaelia-Four finally dipped below the horizon, casting the valley in a deep, peaceful violet. In the garden below, the fire lilies began to pulse with a soft, steady crimson light, their petals opening to catch the first cool breeze of the night cycle. Elias Vane stood on the roof, his hand resting on Kaylin's shoulder, watching the stars blink into existence one by one. He didn't check his wristcom. He didn't look for a text. He simply stood there, a scrubber in the quiet, breathing air that he had finally truly helped make clean.